thank you so much for being on the show and for all of your incredible work on this. We enjoyed your book very much, and also were thoroughly horrified by all of it, obviously. But so many Americans felt kind of blindsided when Roe v. Wade was overturned. And yet you walk us through every step of the way. This was not an overnight shocking decision. This was decades in the making. Walk us through some of that.
You mean the secret plan to overturn Roe v. Wade?
Yes, yes.
There was one. For 50 years, the anti-abortion movement tried so hard, right? They made it their life's work, generational commitment to try to overturn Roe. This was a moral commitment for them, the greatest moral calling of their lives. And they were not successful until about 10 years ago. Something changed, and we've taken to calling it this was the last decade, the final decade of the Roe era in American life. They had new tactics, new strategies, and they really radicalized along with the Republican Party and did what many Americans thought was unimaginable, which was overturning Roe v. Wade.
Now, in telling this story, how much of this did you find was based in sort of a moral argument, and how much of this felt like it was groups who had political motives who were trying to utilize Roe as a piece in which to gain more political power?
Well, certainly there's a really deep moral and spiritual element. These are conservative Christians, largely evangelicals and Catholics, and they see this as a story that's rooted in, biblical kind of terms. But I think there's also this broader effort, and what they effectively want to do is overturn elements of the sexual revolution and return the American family to a more traditional time. I think one of the most interesting things we found in our book was the role that abortion plays. Of course, abortion is about the right to terminate a pregnancy and when a woman can legally do that. But it also has this great symbolism in American life. It sort of symbolizes for people morality and religion and medicine and, of course, politics and gender roles and all these really big things. And so if you want to understand where this election might be going, and if you want to understand where the country might be going, the story of the Fall of Roe is one way to understand that.
I guess you articulate that Roe has taken on such a larger... It's not just one thing anymore. Was that always the case, or can you pinpoint when that really started to pick up steam?
Well, look, our book starts in 2013, which is right when Obama won re-election, and it's also when conservative Christians became a slight minority in America. So this is a group that felt that they were losing their hold on American life, losing their sort of traditional power in American life, and I think abortion rights were one way that they thought they could sort of return the country to where it was before. So it is this larger fight, and we're seeing that play out now in sort of efforts around IVF, around some forms of contraception. This is, of course, about abortion, but it's about so much more than just abortion.
One of the things that I really appreciated about this book is you go through the backstories of all of these characters. You don't paint them as heroes and villains. You talk about Leonard Leo from the Federalist Society and talk about how he personally was affected, what formed his faith.
Leonard Leo, devout Catholic, obviously legal mastermind, but the story that motivated him the most is the death of his daughter when she was 14. Their firstborn daughter had a very difficult prenatal diagnosis. They decided to give birth and raise her. And when we talked with him, he talked a lot about suffering and his views, motivated by Catholic theology, about suffering and salvation in the human experience. And so for him, that really shaped not only how he wanted to run his own family, but how he sees how the entire country and world should be structured.
For a lot of these anti-abortion activists, those two worlds are intertwined. This isn't a story that you can understand just through politics or just through religion. These are intertwined stories, and I think that's part of what we really tried to get out at the book, was tell those intertwined stories in a way that reflected sort of the intimate. This is such an intimate issue, that reflected that intimacy and how personal it is for these people. Look, it's something that everyone understands. If you've had a baby, if you were with someone who had a baby, if you were a baby, at some level, you inherently understand how this works and what this is about. And I think it's not the kind of issue that even for the most committed activists that can be disconnected or rooted just in politics.
Now, this book talks about the successes of the activists.
Right.
A lot of them are the grassroots activists on the right. What were the failings of the left in this fight?
Well, look, I think it was there was this profound sense of denial across the left. And in some ways that's reasonable, right? It's really hard to believe that this right that people had for generations could suddenly just vanish. And because of that, Democrats, they would always go out, Democratic candidates, and warn about threats to Roe or Roe could fall. And people just didn't believe them. Like, we have in the book tons of polling and focus groups where the issue just didn't resonate with people because they didn't believe it would happen. And so it's hard to see and prevent something that you don't think is happening, right? And then, of course, they got very, very unlucky. Trump won, and he got 3 appointments to the Supreme Court, unheard of since Ronald Reagan. And there becomes a turning point, where the march to end Roe effectively becomes unstoppable for Democrats and the abortion rights activists.
There's part of the civil rights activists were rooted in the Christian community. Where's the disconnect? Why have liberals not been able to connect with the Christian community since then?
Well, conservative Christians figured out that this wasn't really about cultural opinion. A majority of Americans supported abortion rights for decades, but for them, this was about finding ways to pull the levers of power, right? You can kind of do all the moral conversation, education that you want on either side of this, but if you don't have power, you can't do anything. So they figured out exactly what levers, where in the country, at what levels of government, from the smallest state house lobbyists all the way up to the presidency, the Supreme Court, and they identified them, they pulled them, and then they're able to change the culture that way, right? Instead of having culture change the law.
Yeah, look, I think we think of politics as working one way, right? People protest, public opinion changes, politicians respond, the culture changes. This is a really different kind of story. This is, a majority of America supported Roe for decades. But these activists on the right, these conservative Christian activists, were able to seize controls of these levers of power and change the culture effectively through force.
Now, take a step back into what's happening now.
Yeah.
We see the Republican platform seems to be softening on abortion, at least not articulating that they want a federal ban. We see what happened with mifepristone at the Supreme Court. Do you see a recalculation happening?
Two different things are happening at once here, right? Like, obviously, Trump and a lot of Republican leaders see that this is now a losing issue for them. I mean, Roe was a foundation for so long. Republicans were able to use it in a certain way to motivate key parts of their base, and that's obviously really changed. But now, things we think of as maybe losses for the anti-abortion movement, they're able to reframe and see them as wins, right? I mean, even the platform can be doing whatever it's doing, right?
In their minds.
But they're on the ground thinking in these generational long terms of how they can change the groundwork similarly to how they overturned Roe, right? They're thinking long term about what does this mean for how we can restrict IVF? Right? What does this mean for access to some forms of birth control? That is such a different long game than Democrats are playing. So in a way, it is definitely a power struggle right now. The two movements, the anti-abortion activists and the Republican Party, needed each other to gain power and to accomplish their mutual goals. So that we're seeing that as a tension, but this is a movement that cannot be undercounted. I mean, they accomplished one of the biggest political resurgences this country has ever seen, and under the noses of people, many of whom just weren't paying attention.
Where do we go from here? I mean, are women going to have to just run for president and have presidential immunity in order to legally have an abortion?
It's worth pointing out that many of the most prominent figures in the anti-abortion movement are women, that there was a strategy to put women at the front of that movement. I think, I've asked a lot of abortion rights activists, like, that very question. What happens now? It took 50 years for Roe to fall. How many years does it take for it to return? And nobody knows. It's an unanswerable question, but nobody's saying 1 year. Nobody's saying 5 years. This is 10 years. This is 20 years. There's no magic wand. President Biden talks about restoring Roe. there's no way to do that without a margin in the Senate that feels almost impossible unless they overturn the filibuster and then all agree on what that looks like, which, as we know about the Senate, that's an extremely high bar to clear. So there's no easy answer here. There's not some thing that can just snap back in place and Roe returns. I think the country is in for many more decades of wrangling over this issue.
For the disheartened folks who see this story, what can they take away? What positive change can they make?
Look, I think one of the things that has been that was most powerful for the anti-abortion was this sense of denial. They did something because nobody believed they could do it, and that's been really shattered now. So I think there's a lot more awareness of what's going on. I think people are paying a lot more attention to what's happening, not only with abortion rights, but with things like IVF and some forms of contraception. So like all political issues, I think this is one of engagement and awareness, and I do wonder if I do think we're seeing more of that now.
And there's this question of can Democrats respond with any kind of generational plan in the way that Republicans had? I mean, it was just
No. Do you need an answer?
That was
Now we know.
We've answered that.
I mean, this is asymmetrical warfare. It has been for a very long time. And there's a real question. I mean, even people like Hillary Clinton told us that the Democrats just don't have the same kind of infrastructure on their side. So there's an open question as to, are they thinking just in election cycles, or are they thinking about 1 generation, 2 generations from now?
Well, we so appreciate all of the work that you're doing and you being on here tonight. We're still hopeful that there will be your next book, The Re-Rise of Roe, putting out all the good prayers for that.
Get the sequel going.
Get the sequel going. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
The Fall of Roe is available now. Elizabeth Dias and Lisa Lerer